What is this, number 2 or number 3?
On the podcast once. I was on your week in review once, so this will be number 3, depending on how you.
Yes, getting into the Hall of Fame of Blood Origins.
Well,
and you suggested I would even count the Aldo Leopold podcast that you were a part of, but not technically like on.
Yeah. That was great. I really appreciate you doing that and bringing the perspective that you did to it. That's what's
Listen,
really
who else is going to be so honest to say, I'm going to have the foremost expert on Aldo Leopold and his biography, and then admit that I've never read San County Almanac?
Well, I admire your honesty. So do you have the book now?
It's on my bedside table, and I'm halfway through it.
Oh, yeah, it's really interesting, so now I've done a couple. I just did one with Randy Newberg, and we talked about a bunch of stuff. But it was all very Leopoldian, what we talked about. And I did Ranella's podcast, and I was the San County Almanac guy, and Carl Malcolm was the Gila Wilderness and more of the biographer thing. But yeah, you had the expert Kurt Miney on. And,
yeah, Kurt was amazing.
Yeah, he really is. He's a very soft-spoken, very bright, and he knows Leopold in and out. The only other one that I put at that level is that he actually had Leopold's same position at the university. His name's Stan Temple, world-renowned ornithologist. And I've done a bunch of work with Stan. I've done a little bit of work with Stan, but I've gotten to know him pretty well. And when Stan talks and starts to interpret or quote Leopold, if you close your eyes, you feel like Leopold is speaking, because we don't have a recording of Leopold's voice, I'm aware of, at least.
Really?
And, yeah. Isn't that interesting? I mean, he died in 1948. It's not like, I don't know. It's not like
interesting.
Impossible.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Well, the other guy that Kurt Mine, have you heard of Baird Callicott?
Oh, yeah.
Jay Baird?
Yeah.
Yeah, Kurt put me on him thinking he was in my backyard in Memphis, but they'd lost contact so long that he actually has moved up into the middle of Kentucky.
Huh. Interesting.
But he's like, you need to talk to that guy.
So, yeah, I did some work with the Leopold Foundation, and part of why I reached out to you is I also reached out to some other podcasts that I'm an admirer of, and to encourage them to do this, to do a podcast featuring Leopold, San County Almanac, and the 75th anniversary, and then the 100th anniversary of the Gila National Wilderness. And to hear those guys, Carl and Kurt, weave the stories and give their perspectives. And, Carl had spent that time in the Gila as an ecologist down there. I think it was an important thing to do, and I really appreciate that you did it and brought your perspective. Everybody brings a perspective and has a different line of questioning. My friend Reed Bryant, who has the Orvis shooting.
Yeah, I know Reed.
Yeah, we're good buds. He had them on. Hal Herring has had them on. Ed Roberson is having them on. And Randy is having them on soon. And then,
man, you should be getting a commission for all these podcasts that you're putting them on there. Doug, come on.
Well, I mean, I like to help the foundation out where I can.
Has anybody got a signed copy of the San County Almanac?
Well, I can tell you I don't. Why would
Is there such a thing in existence?
Well, I don't think so, because it wasn't really published until after his death.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
But Carl Malcolm, who was on Ranella's podcast and the Meat Eater podcast, we'll be talking about it, he had a copy signed by one of the kids, which is close, I guess.
So none of those like original stories in their sort of original form signed at all? Nothing?
Well, I don't know. You're putting me on the spot, man. I don't know.
No, I
um,
know, no. Just it's super interesting. Super
oh
interesting.
no, it's. But if you are ever in Wisconsin, stopping by the Eldo Leopold Foundation, where who the shack and the farm that he bought at the San County Almanac Wow is there. It's about 35 miles to my east here, and I spend a fair amount of time over there. So when you start talking about San County Almanac and that first part of that book, the phenology, well, what he was observing and describing is what I was observing and describing, or not describing, but observing, that he was putting to words because it's the same area. I'm 30 miles away. And I was handed the book by the librarian at my high school when I was 16 years old. And that really spoke to me because it was describing what I was experiencing. And I think that book, as you're getting through it, you'll see now you're probably into sketches here and now, or here and there. Sketches here and there, and that's more about his travels and whatnot. And then the end is the upshot, and it's the philosophical stuff. That's kind of a phase of life that I'm in now.
Yeah. Well, Doug, let me ask this question: since the topic we want to talk about is CWD. Have you been hunting the same place in Wisconsin all your life?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I was away for a couple of years, but I'm 65. This year will be my 53rd year of hunting. We started deer hunting here when you were 12 years old. And we hunted the farm a little bit every year, even if we went elsewhere. Like back in the day when I was a kid, you had to go up north for the real deer hunting experience, and my dad wanted us to have that. And quite frankly, there weren't that many deer around here, not like we have now. And so yeah, I've been hunting the same area, and I've seen since 1971 is when I turned 12, and so I've seen the change in the. Certainly there's been some change in the landscape, but it's been really in the deer population. Deer have been very well managed here in Wisconsin. If you're basing that management on having more than a surplus of deer, and that their range has expanded and all of that. But when I was a kid, I was talking with Brian Richards, who I hope you, if you're not, we need to talk about him later. But and Brian grew up just north of me here, about 30 miles, and we were talking about it. And I said, well, how many deer do you think we had per square mile of habitat in those days? And he said, I don't know, 10 to 15. Now it's 65 to 70.
Wow.
Except where CWD is starting to ravage the herd. And so when I was a kid, when you saw a deer, you told people about it, right? And now it's like, another one. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm still fascinated by them, and I still marvel at them and all of that, but you definitely have a different experience. And the other thing that happens to me now, and this is a little down the road in our conversation, but when I see deer out, and I'll take a drive in the evening and see deer, I'm looking at them, of course, to see if there's any antler bucks and, what the numbers are like and all that kind of stuff. But one of my first reactions is to look at that deer, or look at those deer, that group of deer, and see if there's any of them that are showing clinical signs of CWD. Drooping head, ears, all the stuff that we used to see that you would watch for in your cattle. I grew up with this farm, and so animal husbandry is sort of second nature to me. So you look for the hunchback, the head down, the ears are kind of drooping, and then of course the thinness. And I'm sorry to say that it's not a rare occurrence to see that anymore. Just driving about, you'll see. You see a deer by the side of the road that's obviously in the clinical stage of chronic wasting disease.
Yeah. So Doug, when you were growing up, say let's go 12 through 20, this is mid 70s, early 80s. Mm-hmm. Was there? Well, maybe it's a two-part question. I don't think was anybody talking about CWD then? And two, do you think you had CWD then?
No one was talking about CWD then, and no, I do not think that we had CWD then. The scientists can talk to you about that more, but it's definitely no one talked about it. Deer disease. I mean, nobody talked about EHD either.
Right.
There wasn't any kind of deer disease that you concerned yourself with. As for why do I say that? Well, I'll leave that up to the scientists a little bit, but yeah, you didn't see deer like that. And where
What do you mean you didn't see deer
you
like
didn't
that?
see sick deer like that,
Okay.
you do see now. And when they identified it south of us here, about 60 miles, it was classic CWD, clinical signs. So then the question
Which
becomes,
is what?
they've thinned down, they're lethargic, they are, they're kind of unaware of their surroundings, and then eventually they die, and they die of pneumonia. They die, because their body starts to shut down. I mean, their brain is rotting away, right? It's like many things. Ultimately, what kills you is your heart stops, or you die of pneumonia or whatever. But so when we hear some of the skeptics say, no, show me a deer that died of CWD. Well, they've died of other causes that are a result of not having brain function.
It's like COVID, right? Somebody doesn't die of COVID. They die of the complications from COVID.
That's exactly right. So that is not something that we were aware of. And so that probably begs I'm not going to ask you questions for you.
You can, of course you can. You've been on the podcast so many times, you're allowed to ask me questions.
But so that begs the question, doesn't it? Well, then how did it get here?
Yeah. How did it get there? 60 miles away, it never was there before. How did it get there?
Well, some people would say, like Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which is the human equivalent of prion disease, that it could be spontaneous. Is that possible? Sure, it's possible. But what seems to be the case, and again, I would have you ask Brian Richards about this kind of thing. How did it get here is a question that's hard to answer. But in reaction, like, let's not transport carcasses. There's rules against that now. There are rules against transporting, in some cases, and I don't know all of the rules everywhere, but live animals. Well, if you're putting it in the back of you're putting a live deer from a captive cervid facility and then putting it in the back of a truck and taking it to another place, and it happens to be positive, well, you've just transported it however far you just drove, as opposed to a progression that happens in the natural setting, animal to animal. When we were talking about this on another podcast, and Brian and I were a part of, he said something about the tradition of hunters going to Colorado and Wyoming from southwest Wisconsin, and you kill a elk or a mule deer or whatever out there, and you strap that sucker and put it in the back of your truck and you bring it home. My dad was one of those guys.
Yeah.
And I said, so my dad could have brought CWD.
And I think that's you're making a good point here, because I think when people talk about CWD, it's very much a whitetail issue. Okay? But CWD occurs in the whole, like, conspiracy theory, the whole rhetoric, the passion around CWD seems to be centered in the whitetail world, wherein you have CWD in the elk world, you have CWD in the mule deer world. It just doesn't seem to be like it's not a hot topic.
And they'll say, "Oh, we lived with it for a long time." Well, there are parts of Colorado and Wyoming where there was CWD in very high prevalence. That prevalence is next to zero now, and the reason for that is the mule deer and elk. So you have to have animals for it to continue, and so why for it to be passed on one to the other. So why in an area like that? What ended up happening, of course, is that the population got so low, and there's studies on this. I mean, I'm not an expert about that. I'm not an expert about any of this. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a scientist. I'm a guy who grew up with a farm. So I have an animal husbandry background, and I can talk about my experience and my perspective of living with it for 20 years and spending a lot of time with smart people who do more about it. And then being skeptical of all of it, right? Skepticism being the chastity of the intellect. Being skeptical about all of it, making my own drawing my own conclusions from it all. When you look at, I always wonder, well, what from whose perspective, right? Where is an attitude coming from? Like, oh, let's not worry about it. And then I start looking into who might be concerned, who that might be. There's usually money involved, a business involved, and or folks who just don't want to know. There's an old line in a Grateful Dead song: you ain't gonna learn what you don't want to know. And and I think that's we would rather it not be. And believe me, Robbie, I would rather this not be also. And from my personal perspective, it doesn't really make, I'm 65 years old. It doesn't really make that much difference what's happening in the rest of my hunting life, right? I mean, eating CWD positive meat is, if it happened to be, is not going to kill me. I'll die of something else. But when I see the effect that it's starting to have on the resource, and that effect is, expanding, I think if we're doing more than just thinking about ourselves and our business and our time, that the land ethic, the Leopoldian ethic, would tell us that we need to be concerned about what's happening in the future. In my words, it's not ours; it's just our turn. That's my perspective on this whole thing.
Yeah. So talk me through this, because I think a lot of people that have heard about CWD, done a little bit of research, they know about it, they're aware of it. I would say very, very few people are aware of the ultimate implication of CWD, which is a reduction in the resource. Because I think, again, one of the myths here is that CWD isn't always lethal.
Well, that is a myth. Science shows us that it is, once a deer has CWD, it is a death sentence. And it is somewhere between 18 and 30 months, 24 being the average. And for most of that period of time, that deer walks around looking just fine. And then it's the last 6 to 8 weeks of the disease that it has grown so exponentially in the body that in the last 6 to 8 weeks, it starts to show signs. And it starts with things like, and I have an example of this on our property, where they just aren't as aware. Big 3 years ago, big, beautiful buck on the property, just perfect 10-pointer, 160-inch, 5-year-old, beautiful buck. I pull into so it's actually on the property adjacent to ours that I have management control over. And I pull into that property, and here, standing in the driveway, right by the house, is this big, beautiful buck that I had on camera before. And he stands there and he looks at me, and I was like, oh, well, this is first week of October, pre-rut, but I figure the big boy's out having a look around, as it were.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking for a doe, and there isn't any. And this deer looked at me with a look of deer in the headlights. That look of like not comprehending what I was, or why, or if he should be concerned. A 5-year-old white-tailed buck in southwest Wisconsin is one of the wariest damn animals that there is. And he was not wary at all. So I took the camera, took my phone out, I stopped the truck, opened the door, and he's standing 30 yards from me. And I took pictures of him, and he looked at me for a while, and I thought, well, took a little video of him. He walked down behind the house. I backed up. He walked around the other side of the house. He looked at me again. And then he just walked down by the creek, but never. And I kept looking for a doe, because my initial thought was, oh, it's pre-rut. There's a doe around here who might be. It's like, well, too soon for her to be in heat, but all that stuff's going through my head. And I thought, that doesn't bode well. 2 weeks later, my buddy who hunts with me on that property shot him with his crossbow. And when he described how the deer came in, there were 3 bucks, and this guy the other 2 were wary and kind of moving through, and this guy was just kind of wandering through like he was on a Sunday walk. and he killed him. And it was actually the guy's first big buck, and he was very excited. And of course, and he's an emerging hunter, an adult onset hunter. He's a great guy. I mean, I didn't want to say, "Hey, buddy, you think your buck's got CWD?" But I literally wrote it down that deer has the signs, the early signs of CWD. It'll be interesting to see. Now, in our area,
did it test out?
Oh, you bet it did. It was CWD positive.
Okay.
And so he didn't have any physical signs. He was beautiful. He was beautiful. So that was, a pretty interesting thing. And I have seen that more just recently. A few days ago, I was coming back from a thing with a friend of mine, and we're driving along. I said, "Stop." And here's this doe. I can send you pictures and videos of this stuff. There's this doe standing. She's drinking a little bit of water out of where a culvert crosses the road, and there's a little bit of water there. And when we went by, I could see this. I could see the back of a deer, and I could see her hip bones. And I said, "Stop." And Greg stops. The deer looks up at us. Well, by the time I could get my camera out and get a picture of her, she had walked away a little bit. And I just whistled at her, and her head kind of went. And her ears were up, and she didn't look like this, but she was skin and bones. And I was like, that deer isn't going to last another week. Now, there are other things that make deer sick and that, can kill a deer. So the only way we know for sure if it was, we got it tested. We have so many CWD positive deer here now that the DNR is not interested in testing road-killed deer, or ones that you find, here's one dead in the field, which I find. They only want to test hunter-killed deer, quite honestly, because we're really not doing it. We quit doing anything about CWD 12 years ago.
What's the prevalence rate, do you think, in your neck of the woods?
Oh, I can tell you what it is. Percent positive in my county is 30%. So 30% of all deer killed. On my farm in our property, so 600 acres, we killed 47 deer on our property last year. 29% of them were positive. But here's the startling thing. It used to be when we first had, and this is all in 7 years now, this will be our 8th year of having positive, because we've had our deer tested as long as we could. And then when they let us test every one, we did. Initially, they were only letting you test older deer because they said those are the ones that are most likely to be positive, except in emerging areas. I mean, this is one of the things that we found out, right? Well, which are the deer that break out into new territories? It's not the old buck or the old doe.
Yeah, it's the young bucks.
Yeah, it's the young bucks. So they're the carriers, right? They're the ones who are taking it out into new areas. The first 2 deer that we had test positive were in 2007 were 2.5-year-old bucks. One of them had real distinct antlers. We'd never seen him before, on cameras and stuff. We're good Midwestern whitetail hunters. We had trail cameras all over the place. Had never seen him, which of course doesn't mean that he couldn't have been there already, but we hadn't seen him before. Positive, and then I killed a 2.5-year-old, and he was positive as well. And that was really the first year where we weren't doing the old let him go so he can grow. I was like, the one that I killed was a nice buck, nice 2.5-year-old, maybe 125 inches of antler. But that was the change in attitude about it. Was we're not gonna do any of that. I've never been one who. I mean, we had this little thing where you had to wear a hat if you killed a sombrero if you killed too small of a buck, but that was kind of as intense as we got about it, right? It's good old deer camp, sort of chiding of each other. And now we don't have any of those rules for a variety of reasons. One mostly being because of CWD, and then the other part of it, quite honestly, I don't want to manage people.
Yeah,
let people shoot what they're happy with, and then we'll all be happy with them.
Doug, in growing up, you obviously, when you started this conversation, we talked about if you saw a deer, you were celebrating. And obviously deer management in Wisconsin has gone through the roof, and you've essentially gone, do you think you're on the back end of this bell curve in which you had, what is your deer population still at 65 a square mile? Or talk us through that. Like you've gone through that bell curve.
Okay. So when I was a kid, here's an example. Here's kind of the real life example of how it actually affected us as hunters. when I was a kid, we all had to go, if you wanted to kill a doe or have the opportunity to kill a doe, they had this thing called a party tag. So 4 hunters had to buy their license by now, fill out the paperwork, because of course in those days everything was paperwork too. And then along with $20 or whatever it was, the 4 of you would send it in and ask for a doe tag for your area. And you might get it. So it was a draw. So you always got a buck tag, and then you could apply for a party tag. It was called a party tag. So one person, you had to wear an armband if you were and you had to designate who was going to shoot the doe of that group of 4 people. So they had to wear an armband. It was a whole thing. Now, every weapon license that you get in our county, you get 4 doe tags. So I get a buck tag for gun season. I get a buck tag for bow season. I get 8 doe tags. And if I filled all those, I can go and buy as many as I want. So to think about how, that just kind of shows you what the population difference is, right? And that's the way things work. Remember
more deer, the better, essentially, right?
Oh, yeah. You can never be too many. From a hunter's perspective, a lot of hunters' perspectives, right? There can't be too many deer.
Mm.
But we're talking about more than surplus. So now all of a sudden what we began to see, and this is not all of a sudden, but over time what we began to see was the impact that deer were having on the rest of the ecosystem and on their habitat. Elder Leopold talked about this 80 years ago. Up in northern Wisconsin, after the cutover, deer population exploded, and then the deer population exploded because after that cutover, all that new growth was coming up. So it was all this food for those deer, but then what happened is that population exploded so much, and they were still managing like 1 buck. They were still doing you kill bucks. Population, we can't have too many deer, but then they ate themselves out of habitat. And the deer yards up there, they're taking hay out to the deer yards. They're doing all of that. And Leopold wrote about it. And one of the things that he wrote about was, maybe it'd be okay if we had a few predators around that would take care of this. And he was also advocating for shooting more does so that the ecosystem would have an opportunity, or the habitat would have an opportunity to recover. 80 years ago. Well, he was called all kinds of things. It's called Deer Wars. You can look it up. It's a really interesting article. A couple of interesting articles. One of them's in Deer and Deer Hunting magazine, and I think it's probably the best article that I've ever seen in that magazine. Post Pat Durkin.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and down here, deer were just really starting to emerge, and it happened very quickly. So by the time I left the area, and went back to college, and then I moved out to New England for a while, and I would come back for deer hunting. It went from that one person, or you had to have 4 people to get 1 buck tag, that every tag was then a hunter's choice. So you could put whatever you wanted. You could shoot a buck or a doe. Well, you don't shoot the girls because that's what brings the boys around. You just hear the old farmers saying all that.
Of course.
Right? And the other thing that was starting to happen is that bow hunting was becoming much more popular. When I was a kid, bow hunting was not something anybody did. You killed deer with guns. There was a bow season, but that's what we did,
Mm-hmm.
Heck, growing up on a farm, like my buddies, you weren't going to be sitting in a tree waiting for a deer to walk by in the first part of November anyway, because you had corn to pick and hay to put up and all of the stuff. So by the 3rd week in November, when our deer season starts, going deer hunting was what you got, was kind of the reward for getting your work done. We went small game hunting, we did all that, but you go and do that for a couple hours in the middle, or early in the morning or late in the afternoon.
Right.
So bow hunting wasn't a thing. And with bow hunting came trophy hunting. I don't know how else to, and I don't have any rub with that. It's really interesting to to think about that in those times and how it all changed. We were able to hunt kind of wherever we wanted to, right? You knew everybody. And now that's very different. In those days, you had to post your land, put up no trespassing signs. Otherwise, it was implied permission.
But was it legal permission?
It was,
Like Maine, if you don't post, you can hunt?
yes,
Okay.
that's
Okay,
exactly
okay.
right. And now it's exactly the opposite. So
Yeah.
everybody was posting their land. People, I shouldn't say everybody, people started posting their land. And the other thing that happened during that period of time is people from away started buying land. So people from the city, and they were buying it for whatever reason. And now 60% of our county is owned by people who don't live
Hmm.
there. At the same time, agriculture is changing, going from these small dairy farms that I grew up with to, I can't even describe. We have as many cattle in this county as we did when I was a kid, but rather than 350 or 400 farms, they're on like 6 farms. So it's that the get bigger, get out um, mantra of agriculture. So all of those changes are going on at the same time. So, and in that, deer just did so well. But so by we quit dairy farming in 1988, and by the mid 90s, I was living in New England during the 80s, and teaching high school, and then I moved back to Wisconsin in 1990. So I came back, and it's like, holy moly, there's more deer than ever, and that's what people got used to. But
big abundances of deer, yeah. Big densities.
And again, if you bought land because you just want it for hunting, more deer the better, right? If they weren't bothering your crops, well, not that big of a deal. Ag tags became a thing, where agricultural damage, because you can be reimbursed, and then you've got to get tags, and there's all this stuff that go along with that. I'll give you an example. In the early 90s, if you would do something like plant one of the practices for planting trees is you would plant a row of white pines, and you would plant a row of white or red oaks. And the idea was that the pines would train those oaks to be tall and straight and good timber trees. It worked highly effectively. And when you see, and I get out on a lot of properties because of my land management consulting, and you can see, like, there was almost like a cutoff. By the early 90s, when they were doing that, all you ended up with was pines. Because the
saplings got nailed by the deer.
Exactly. Yeah. On the other hand, if it was just before that, you see these big, beautiful oaks that are now, really big trees all in a row, and they've been limbed, and they were doing great. It's just a really interesting, all of those dynamics happening at the same time. And then the advent of trophy hunting and more of it. And, and that's really been, I guess, in this area, the last 25 years. I mean, everybody was into killing a big buck if you could, but it was, you just had an antler on it, shot it. I mean, that was nobody thought about it like that.
Yeah. When do you think CWD started becoming prevalent in your area?
Well, 2002 is when it was identified.
Okay.
And that was 60 miles south of us. So it would have had to have been there for a while for there to be a sick deer sighted.
Sure.
They were doing monitoring. They were taking a certain amount of deer from different areas and testing them for various diseases.
But 60 miles is far from you. Like it's
on the other side of the Wisconsin River.
Yeah, like from a deer ranging perspective, that's a long way.
Except for, here's an example. Southwest, Richland County, where I am, the counties surrounding us and a little bit south of us, just south of the river where this started, or where it was first identified, south of the Wisconsin River, which is a big ass river, I don't think that my county is a lot different than others. 85% of the county is deer habitat. And interestingly, in my county, at least 95% of that land, that deer habitat, is privately owned.
Okay.
So if you start to wrap your head around, well, what if you're going to do something about deer management? Well, you're going to have to be working with private landowners, and you're either going to work with them or you're going to force them to. And we had a thing called Earn a Buck for a while, which I thought was a great program.
Right.
It was a great program. It was the best deer management population program there ever was. Managing population manages disease. But you go back,
you need everyone on board.
Yeah, you need everyone on board. And I can remember when Earn a Buck first started, I guys telling me, won't they just sell me a trophy tag? I'll pay $500. I don't want to shoot a doe. And I'm like, well, why don't you want to shoot a doe? It helps to, have bigger bucks. Well, how does it help to have bigger bucks? Well, competition and all these different things. And then the other part of it is if there are fewer does, bucks are on their feet looking for them during the rut. If there's a plethora, if there's an overabundance of antlerless deer or of does, buck doesn't have to travel far. He's not going to, especially an older one.
Mm-hmm.
I have talked to dozens of bow hunters, especially because the rut hits during bow season here, and they go, man, the best thing for killing big bucks was when we had earn a buck. And it was because it did knock the population out. You can go on the Deer Metrics website, the DNR Deer Metrics website, and you can see how many antlerless deer were being killed during that period of time, and then how it dropped off as soon as earn a buck was taken away, and people just quit doing it. And I would like to think that, well, if
did you see a commensurate deer population increase?
Yes.
With that change in management regime?
Yep. And oddly enough, or coincidentally enough, or not surprisingly, a rise in the prevalence and a quickening of the spread of CWD. High populations, deer close together. I mean, what do we know about disease, right? If we're going to spread anything around, high population is a place where it's going to get spread around the quickest. I'm a little reluctant to compare it to COVID, but think about COVID days. It was the cities where when it first hit and spread so quickly. Out here in the country where I'm in, it was like, I guess I'll stay home. I mean, is it in the air outside? I mean, it's sort of that whole thing, right? Everything that we we kind of erred on the side of caution, and we're in a position where we could. But it wasn't. Interestingly, the first COVID cases here where people were kind of like, what's the big deal? And they ended up going to, then they caught it in a group of people and then brought it back to the village. And, So it was that kind of thing. That's exactly how chronic wasting disease spreads more quickly in a higher population. And there will be some people there's this whole discussion and a lot of hand-wringing and discussion has gone on about, is it a density-dependent disease based on population, or is it a frequency-dependent disease, which is more based on behavior and that sort of thing? Mm-hmm. Tim Vandelian, who's the professor at the University of Wisconsin, and I think he's the one who has Leopold's position now. I was listening to him talking about it, and somebody asked that question. He goes, well, I think the evidence would suggest it's both. Mm. It's sort of like, I noticed on the Olympics, they're bringing back the old tastes great, less filling argument about Miller Lite. And the guy goes, it's both. Well, so is this. And we have seen that.
Right? Have you seen, as obviously earn a buck change, your density and your population has gone up. Do you think have you seen population declines yet because of CWD?
Personally, I have not on our farm. We are killing more deer than we ever have. Killed 47 on approximately a square mile. So if there's 65 deer per square mile, and the year before we killed 40, the year before that 40, the year before that 38. And I don't want to say indiscriminately, but I don't tell people you can't shoot a small buck or you can't. What I do is like, you need to shoot a doe. You don't have to shoot the doe before you shoot the buck, but if you shoot a buck, you're damn right you're going to shoot a doe. So I don't want people feeling any of that pressure. I want them to enjoy the hunt and look at their deer for whatever. That's up here in Northeast, and I will say this, and people tell me this, well, you got that great big farm, and 600 acres in farm country is a fair amount of acreage, and I don't have any crops on it. It's all habitat. It's a conservation reserve program. We've got, I've done various things, and I don't do anything like food plots or anything. I used to do that stuff, but I got over it. 7 or 8 years ago, 8 or 10 years ago, I just quit doing it. It was like first of all, food plots in farm country is kind of like taking sand to the beach, right? That you have it's everywhere, and around us are farms that have corn and beans, and everything's corn and beans. There's a little bit of alfalfa, but when I was a kid, it was mostly hay, some corn, a little bit of wheat. That was new seeding, but soybeans weren't something that we grew around here. Deer love soybeans. So we have all this habitat, and they're moving in and out of, they're maybe going out to eat in those crops, and then coming back into our place. And we've got and so we have really great habitat. Not because it was intentional, but because we were doing good land management, good forestry management, land management, and providing for other members of the ecosystem is also, surprise, good deer habitat. Deer can live kind of anywhere. But by doing that, so anyway, our northern part of the county, and again, it kind of goes back to this thing I was talking about, so much private land. I think that the average, I kind of figured this out one day, and it's about 60 acres, which is the average land ownership size parcel. So think about that. In a section of land, 640 acres, you've got 8 to 10 landowners, as opposed to, I've got most of a section, right? So, and that's a square mile. So all of the, every 40 or 80 or 120, it's a different management idea.
Yeah.
I mean, some people are like, I don't like hunting, and we're not going to let that happen here.
Sure.
And I know of, in the southern part of the county, there was a big chunk of land down there that hunting was not allowed. And of course, once the shooting started, that's where all the deer ran, and they stayed in there until the hunting season was over with. High population in there, the disease gets in there, it starts spreading through them. So the non-hunting landowner was a part of the problem. And then the other part of the problem is the landowner hunter who's like, yeah, I only want to take a deer or two. I'm not concerned about that, and I'm waiting for a big giant buck. So the point is that for every piece of property, you could have a different management strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what Earn a Buck did, right? It made everybody shoot at least a doe before they shot a buck.
Yeah, and it seemed, it's number one, it's obviously keeping the population down, but you would think it's probably even more important today in the CWD landscape that you live in.
Absolutely. The only, there's not a cure for CWD, and again, I let the scientists speak to this, but nothing that I have heard, read, or seen tells me that, they're close. They're going to come up with something. The best they've been able to do is, there's been this discussion of the resistant gene. Well, resistant doesn't mean that it's not going to get CWD. It just means it's going to have it for longer. So
well, that's what I was asking. When I ask about the lethality of CWD, that comes up in the conversation all the time. That you've got some deer that are resistant, but it's not that it's, what's the word? It's not foolproof, right? It's that, as you said, it just takes longer for them to die. It's not the 24-month, maybe it's a 48-month.
I don't know what's going on here, Robbie. You're locked up.
You seem to be glitching a little bit on your end.
Yeah, we're locked up for some reason. Huh.
Yeah, all of a sudden you're like going in and out.
Yep, the same here on this end. There shouldn't be anything else. I mean, my internet seems stable, but it just said it's not. So I don't know. I'm going in. It looks like it is going in and out. Well, it looks like it's on my end, but I guess all of a sudden we're
now it's good. Well, let me ask it again. I guess that's where the thing is coming in, is that people say there are these resistant, quote unquote, deer to CWD, but it's not that they're resistant to death. It's just moving the needle from 24 months to death to 48 months to death.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening here.
Dang.
It held up
You're back
on me
now.
again. Yeah. but I see my internet thing going up and down. And I don't know why that is. Here I stayed at home to do this, thinking it would be the best place, but maybe I should have gone out to the farm. Huh? Anyway, so right, the resistant gene does not stop it from dying. It just allows it to live longer. And I can understand some of the hope in that idea, in that if all you're concerned about is deer getting old so that you get big giant bucks, and the one thing that deer need to get big and giant is to get age on it. So if they are dying in 4 years rather than 2, it could be that 2-year-old or that 1.5-year-old who got it. Well, he's 5.5, and a 5.5-year-old buck around here is ancient, and he's also 170 inches. It's a big buck. I mean, we grow big deer really fast here. I mean, you've got Shangri-La for deer, right? I mean, you've got habitat, and you have food and water, and high mineral content in the water. I mean, it's just like everything. Genetically, we seem to have pretty good animals also. But that's the thing, and there aren't, that is again, I don't want to get too deeply into the science, but my understanding is that those deer don't exist in a very high population in the wild. And part of the reason for that is that they have other issues. So why hasn't that been the predominant gene? Would it eventually, take over and become a part of that? And then there's this whole thing like they're going to do in Oklahoma where let's let some out, that were raised, that we've identified that. And it's like, and it's the regulation of it has fallen under the Department of Agriculture now rather than under the Department of Natural Resources. And there are people in the whitetail industry who are cheering that. And I think that kind of comes back to some of the mentality that's happened with whitetail deer over time, right? Food plots, hinge cutting, planting grasses for bordering, making all of these manipulations to the landscape so that the deer maybe funnel through a particular area. You plant hunt, and I did this stuff too, hunting plots versus food plots versus all of this, rather than improving your habitat, doing the best that you can for all the members in the biotic community, and then spending the time figuring out how deer use it. So rather than, it seems like what's happened to the industry, my friend Ryan Callahan calls it the whitetail industrial complex, that if you want to kill big giant bucks, you need to do this to your land, and you can hold them on your property, and you can do all this stuff, and then you set up this stand in this particular way. I mean, there's hunting coaches, for goodness sakes, and they're doing this. Here's how you set your property up, and the hunter's the trigger man, versus we do all this stuff and then we kind of figure out what the deer are doing. And I'm sure I'm guilty of wanting to know what the deer are doing. I have trail cameras out and they come right to my phone and I have a blast. But everybody's got to rationalize how they approach this to a certain degree. But, it used to go like that. Now it goes like this. I've changed my mind about some of the stuff, which again kind of goes back to maybe the chastity of skepticism being the chastity of the intellect. I can be convinced of, you used to do it that way, but this seems like a better way based on science or based on experience or whatever all that is. So to go back to your original question, which was, have we seen that population drop? Not in my part of the county yet. South of us, I'm on the County Deer Advisory Council, which is a citizen board that we have some input into, like how many tags we're going to give out and that kind of stuff, and quotas. We had people come into the meeting last year because we're supposed to be the voice of the people, and they come in and talk about it. And we had guys just saying, we're not seeing deer by us anymore. Well, what do you mean you're not seeing deer anymore? You're not, and they're lamenting the drop in the number of deer that they're seeing. And of course, they always preface it with, and I hunt, this many days of the year, and all those sort of things. And this one group in particular, I had quite an exchange with them, and I asked them, so have you guys been killing a lot of deer? And their response was, well, some bucks, but no antlerless deer. So because in our county, since 2012, when the rules when Ernbuck went away and all that, we kill 3,000 does a year, we kill 3,000 bucks a year, more or less. There's a little bit of variance, but so we're killing the same amount of deer, and our population has continued to rise on an overall basis based on the best estimates that we can get. Certainly, individual results can vary, and deer move around, and and I don't want to get into how people hunt or what their strategies are and that sort of stuff, but there's so many variables that can be a part of this. Anyway, these guys were talking about, well, no, we are not seeing the number of deer, and no, we haven't been seeing many deer. And that's about 10 miles. It's about 10 miles to the south of us. And I said, like, well, what do you attribute to that to? Because we're killing 40 deer a year up on my property. We're killing 2/3 of what the average population is. And even with 47 last year, you can't tell out on my property. It feels like there are more deer than ever. And there are guys who will continue to say that. And these guys who had been, I don't know what their position was on CWD previous to this, but they kind of mumbled under their breath, well, I guess CWD might have something to do with it. But they were hoping that we would quit allowing or granting so many antlerless permits. And there's two arguments, right? We were given 4 antlerless permits with every weapon as it was, and we're still only killing 3,000 bucks. 3,000 does, 3,000 bucks, 3,000 does. So it didn't matter how many we give or don't give. People just aren't killing more than X amount. And that's a limitation, I think, it's a limitation of access. It's a limitation of people's interest in how many deer am I willing to kill. People want to kill just deer just to do it. I've done that, I tell this story fairly regularly. I killed 7 antlerless deer one day, one deer season. And man, I just piled up a bunch of work, right? And even though I donated 5 of them and all of that, and so 2 things happened to me that day. I was like, well, one, I'm a deer exterminator, and I don't want to be that. I want to be a hunter.
Yeah.
And then the other part that happened to me was like, why don't I get more people? Because I want to continue to kill more and more deer.
Give people the opportunity.
Why don't I get more people on there? And which is where my sharing the land initiative
that
was part of the genesis of that. So, what we know is, and what we see is, there are parts of the county and the county south of us where this first started, is you see the kill going down, the buck kill going down in some of those areas, and the bigger buck kill. And anecdotally, people will say, oh yeah, we don't see them like we used to. Again, on the Wisconsin DNR website, there's a prevalence study area, and that's the southern part of my county, and the southeastern part of our county, and the southwestern part of Sauk, and then across the river. So kind of the core area where this all first happened. And they are doing true prevalence studies there, right? So they're taking all the bucks, the does, they're doing it as opposed to just a percentage positive. I'm doing the prevalence on my own property. 50% of the bucks the last 3 years that we've killed have been positive.
Mm-hmm.
And what's happening is that those deer are getting younger too. Our younger deer, if you wanted to make sure you had a deer that was for the
You're not seeing the age class anymore. And do you think you're attributing that to your hunting pressure or to CWD?
I would say that south of us, the age classes are harder to find because of CWD. By us, we still have the age classes, and I think the reason that we have those age classes, I've got some beautiful bucks on camera right now, and I just hope they all make it.
It's because you've taken out the density?
We have reduced density. We really have. And even though, our goal this year is 50. We didn't have a goal last year. I haven't had here's what my management goal is, how many deer I want to take. It's just like, when the season's over with is when that's how many we got. We just haven't stopped. And last year I had 40 different people hunt that 600 acres. Now some of that was turkey hunting. I think it was about 30 different deer hunters. including some bow hunting. And I leased my farm to some bow hunters, and they get the first shot at it. They get the first opportunity. But then after that, I'm doing a learn to hunt thing with the National Deer Association this year. My sharing land cooperators get opportunity. I'll invite other people in, especially in the antlerless seasons, which are after the 9-day gun season. So we're just not killing more deer. There's so many things that I could go down here. The only tool that has worked to reduce population, which then controls disease, is Ernebuck. And up till 2012, when Ernebuck was in place, prevalence was low, spread was slow. And as an epidemiologist friend of mine said, yeah, the hardest part about my job is that if we're doing our job, everybody goes, what's the big deal? Right? I mean, if we're controlling the disease, what's the big deal?
Well, isn't that the point? Isn't that the point that we're never going to get rid of it?
Nope.
So how do we live with it? And then the question is, how do we live with it? Is, well, what is the desired outcome of how we live with it? The desired outcome is still we want big bucks around. We want to hunt that. We still want to put resource in the freezer.
Yep.
So let's, like you said, earn a buck, take out the does, knock down the density, and have the chance of those big bucks getting to an age that's high enough that you want to hunt them at.
Sure. Understand that a lot of hunters in Wisconsin are casual hunters. They want to go out, especially gun hunters. Bow hunters are pretty intense, but especially gun hunters, they go out opening weekend. They go out and shoot a doe or shoot a buck or whatever, or they want their opportunity for their buck. And some of them, when I was a kid, it didn't matter. If they had antlers like this, didn't matter. I killed a buck. I got my buck, which sounds a little bit, anyway, let that pass. But there was, and still is, a certain mentality about that. I know people who would shoot any buck who wouldn't shoot a doe. And it's like, well, what are you doing with the antlers? Nailing them up on the corn crib? What's the point of what you're doing? If it's for population, well, we don't need more population. If you want to kill bigger bucks, we need a reduced population just for stress levels. There's plenty of groceries out there for them. That's one of the things that we have. Except when the beach, the sand is gone from the beach, the fields are cleaned up. Then they're in my woods, in my shelterwood harvest, where I'm trying to regenerate red and white oak. And they're browsers anyway. They're not going to just eat corn and beans. They browse, they eat greens, they eat brush, they eat the agricultural stuff. That's what they're generalists. They eat all kinds of it. And my God, do they love those red oak seedlings. And so you can't plant trees in rows because you especially with the pine trees, you've built this beautiful sanctuary for them, and then they just walk down and eat the lollipops. I had a 14-acre plantation fail that was planted in the late 90s because all of the oaks were eaten, the pines were fine. If they get real hungry, they'll eat white pines too, but they're only eating the bottom needles and they're fine up above. So that's been an interesting thing. In the oak regeneration that we've been doing, called the shelterwood harvest, we're swamping them. So we're getting so many acorns on the ground and so many trees growing, 10,000 seedlings per acre as opposed to 300. And so, the deer get some of them, but it's more of a natural, you're mimicking what happens in nature with that. But we also spend a lot of time in that shelterwood harvest with deer repellent, which is a small piece of copper at a very high velocity. It's that's one of the best the best deer repellents there is. And just the fact that we're in there keeps them nervous. But it's such great habitat that it's hard. But so, I am trying to manage our property, not just for deer, but for all members of the biotic community, as Leopold would say. But the result is we have a healthy population of deer. Yeah, we're running at 30%. We've got some big giant bucks. Last year we killed a 5-year-old. Ryan Callahan killed a 5-year-old, and it was CWD positive. And then Mark Kenyon, it was 2 guys from Meat Eater who were here at different times. He killed a 4.5-year-old buck, and he was clean as a whistle. He also killed a 6 to 8-year-old doe, which chances are 30 to 40% chance that doe is going to be positive. She was clean too. So we started out last year, the bow season, the first 2 mature deer were clean. By the end of the season, we had a buck fawn testing positive for CWD.
Wow.
So how old was he? You know, a disease that kills them in 2 years. If he hadn't been shot, he was going to be dead in 2 years. And had he not been shot, that deer would have been moved on anyway, and he'd have taken that disease further off. So, I mean, I feel like some of it is we're being neighborly too, right? That we're controlling our population so that it'll control that disease not being spread as quickly to other areas. And those are the only tools we've got. Because as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, and as far as I'm concerned, there isn't anything on the horizon that's here's the cure for CWD. The pixie dust does not exist.
No, look, I think you've just explained to everyone exactly the strategy, which is deer management. Deer management is a way to not get rid of CWD. We're going to live with it. We have to live with it. It's a matter of how do you manage the disease to a goal that you're looking for, whether that goal is big bucks, which probably is most people's goals. The density reduction in your population, you may see less deer, but at the end of the day, you're going to get what you desire, and we live with this disease and are just smart about it. That's what I've heard you say in the last hour, which I think everyone would be nodding their heads north and south on.
Healthy deer. Let's, rather than quality deer management, let's talk about healthy deer management. Healthy deer herd, healthy individual deer. That means a smaller population in areas like this, even though we have all these groceries. And that's better for the entire ecosystem. It's better for the deer herd. It's better for hunting. And in the long term, it's better for the future.
100%. Doug Duren, you're the man. Hall of Famer on the Blood Origins podcast. And anytime you want to come back, we're welcome to have you back. We always appreciate your opinion.
Yeah, well, I thank you a lot for having me, and I enjoy your content. It's just your perspective is so much, it's fresh, and it's like point of view that I don't think about, and then about subject matters that I don't think about often either, and it helps me think about everything that is in my head even more. So, man, I can't thank you enough for what you're doing.
Appreciate you, Doug.
Yeah.